Hello and welcome to Recalibrating with me, Sharee Johnson, where you'll hear healthcare professionals and others sharing their stories of recalibrating life when the unexpected happened. As a psychologist and a coach, I've been listening deeply to people's stories for 35 years, and I've come to believe two things about people. The first is having witnessed so many incredible stories of hope, adaptability, and human capacity, I truly believe that we are all capable of so much more than we really think we are. In times of challenge, humans have demonstrated that over and over again. Here on the Recalibrating podcast, you'll get to hear amazing stories of healthcare professionals and others pivoting, overcoming, and recalibrating their lives. The second thing that the research and my experiences as a psychologist have shown me is that humans need each other. We need people. When we have support around us, when we tell each other our stories, when we connect through the reality of living our lives, we do so much better than when we pull back and hide what's really going on for us. Together on this podcast, we're going to unearth and amplify what helps us as humans individually and collectively to recalibrate in ways that help us change, grow, adapt, even surprise ourselves when life throws us a curveball. This podcast offers you the chance to be inspired and encouraged to meet the unexpected in your life with grace, skills, and a belief in your own human capacity. Life is full of opportunities to recalibrate with agency, the right mindset, the right resources, and the right community. Today's storyteller is Dr. Cheryl Martin. Dr. Cheryl Martin is an emergency physician who works in Melbourne. Cheryl has spent nearly 2 decades working in emergency, trauma and critical care settings in both Scotland and in Australia. Her other main professional interests are in sport, exercise, occupational and lifestyle medicine, and the health and wellbeing and sustainability of the practice of her colleagues. Cheryl has held wellbeing portfolios at department, hospital and college level, and in 2022 she travelled to the US to complete the Stanford Medicine Chief Wellness Officer course. In 2023 and 24 she completed a Global Senior Executive MBA program with Melbourne Business School to further deepen and broaden her strategic leadership, managerial judgment and organisational behaviour lenses. With a passion for science, art and the practical application of how we might optimise our performance and well-being as clinicians, she also holds a great interest in the longevity of medical practice. The Mindful Medic podcast project was born in 2020 and I've had the absolute pleasure of being a guest on that podcast, which we will link in the show notes. Outside of work, Cheryl is an avid trail runner and can usually be found exploring the local coastal and mountain trails with her trail tribe. Cheryl has a yoga asana practice and she describes running in natural settings as her moving meditation. It's with so much joy that I welcome Dr. Cheryl Martin to Recalibrating with Sharee Johnson. Hello, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Sharee. How are you?
I'm great and really delighted to be here to have some time to chat with you. You're so busy with all of your portfolio career. It's lovely to be having some time with you. So thank you for joining us. I want to start with what you're really doing now recently. So you did your initial medical training in Scotland, then you came to Australia, you trained as an emergency physician, and that's still very much a part of your work. You have lots of other things going on now. So can you tell us a little bit about what your medical work looks like today?
Just before I do that, can I thank you, Sharee, for the great honor of being part of this inaugural podcast. I've been following your work for quite some time, and we might get into how we met. I feel like I said to you at the beginning there that I might get as much out of this. I feel like I'm going to get a little coaching masterclass. I saw you last year have a conversation, which hopefully you'll be able to link with Sash and Jane on YouTube as part of Jonathan Fisher's Global Burnout Summit. And that was a coaching masterclass. I think you were both excellent and generous with, just your time and being quite open and vulnerable, discussing, maybe some of the topics that we'll cover today. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Cheryl.
And I've now forgotten the question you asked me initially.
Tell us about your working life, just as it is today, and then we'll get into the backstory after we hear what you're doing
Sure.
currently.
I've been a doctor for nearly 23 years now. And most of that time, I think you had mentioned, is has been in emergency medicine. So I've been a fellow and specialist in emergency for the bulk of the past decade. But perhaps in more recent years have certainly you know I'm going to say kind of changed and transitioned. I think, the kind of beauty of emergency medicine, it is a very general specialty. You do get to really, see across the healthcare system. You probably see the transition points within the system and certainly, some of the pain and struggle points. I'd say that my interest in health and medicine has probably been always general and a bit more diverse and holistic is probably the word that I would use for that. So in more recent years, I've stepped away from, a lot of that frontline emergency medicine, particularly in the past 12 months. Have a current clinical advisor role in the health regulation space, and I also have some clinical work more in what I'm going to call preventative health. The bit that I think, unfortunately, through our healthcare system is very opportunistic, and so that is quite deliberate. It's also encompassing the occupational health space and lifestyle medicine, um, which I think is a term that can be quite difficult to define. But really, I think my value proposition today in that space is that I'm afforded some time and space to explore with people what matters to them in terms of their health, and I think that is a bit of a luxury today. So. That's currently what I'm doing. I have a number of other, I'm going to say some passion projects. I'm continue to be involved in mentoring, peer support. I think doctors' health and well-being is something that I have been involved with for a number of years now, and that's how we connected.
Mm, mm. So let's get into the detail a little bit. You are still doing some clinical work, I think. So I wanted to ask you a question about that, because a lot of doctors feel like when they come to the time that they've invested their energy in their clinical, whatever specialty they're in, and then they start to think about doing other things, maybe education or research or being on committees or, regulation, leaving to work in a private company, even or online, these kinds of new jobs that are coming about. And they worry a lot about leaving their clinical work or getting out of touch with their clinical work. Do you think about that in terms of confidence when you're on the ED floor and you're doing less shifts or less regular shifts?
Yeah, and I think that's something I've been considering throughout my career. And look, I'm now mid-career, probably transitioning the other side of mid-career. And I even see young clinicians considering, this now because I think we're more aware there are more opportunities to use our clinical skill sets in other environments, and I think that is a good thing. But also, in terms of that core clinical skill set, and undoubtedly, deliberate practice is important to stay current, relevant. And I think you have to have some, kind of introspective. We might talk a bit about introspective practice and really kind of self calibration of where you're at and relying on other people around you to kind of know where you are and where your limits are. I think that knowing where we are still competent, that continuing professional development process. And so I think that's very dynamic. I don't think that is linear. I don't think there's one answer, and I don't think there's one size fits all. But I think it's an important conversation, and I think we have to be quite intentional about it.
Mm. I perhaps don't want you to give me a number, but do you feel like you've got a sense of what the minimum is for you? Some doctors say to me, I need to do at least 2 shifts a month in the ED, or I need to be, GPs say I need 1 day a week of being a GP isn't enough for me to feel like I'm current. Do you have a sense, not to give us a number, but do you feel like that becomes?
I think it becomes part of the equation. Yeah.
Mm,
And also thinking, forward, how that might change.
mm,
And also may, change plus or minus. So I think that, and again, I'll speak from my experience, I have kind of stepped out of emergency medicine, stepped back in, and,
mm,
particularly through COVID, I had really planned to do something else and then found myself, very much full time in the clinical space again. Even after my fellowship, I was doing some sports and exercise medicine and exploring other avenues. I've always been, kind of exploring other options. And I think that's quite common in emergency physicians. And I actually see that more generally in the clinical space now. But I think knowing that you can, that can change. And there's certainly people that leave and then want to return because they miss it. They miss their clinical work. And I think that is fascinating. And so how you support them to do that. And there's certainly, again, I'm going to put my regulatory hat on this, like, in terms of recency of practice, we've got certainly some guidelines and actually very strict policy around that. But, I think knowing what that looks like for individuals in terms of the CPD is important.
I really love that you've talked about that with such enthusiasm, Cheryl, because I think it really is dynamic. And people come into coaching with this idea that I have to, whatever, I have to work a minimum of this many shifts, or I have to be current in all sorts of ways. That's really pretty rigid in their thinking. And one of the jobs, I think, of effective coaching is to try and blow some of those things up, those myths or those stories that we're telling ourselves, if only to have a good look at what I'm believing and where did that come from. Your decision ultimately might still be the same. You might still say, oh, I think that I've got about the right number of shifts or the right amount of time that I'm doing CPD or whatever it is. But it's this opportunity to reflect and look carefully and say, well, is that still true for me now at 40 as it was when I was 35? Or, and I love your phrase. I'm going to steal that plus or minus. This plus or minus is really fluid and can move. And we won't talk about, obviously there are a whole lot of caveats we can put around that. Every specialty is going to be different. Let's come back to your journey. You have been in Australia for quite a long time, and I know that your work is mostly in Australia these days, so that's very lucky for us. Can we go back and learn a little bit about the kind of journey? What happened? How did you come from Scotland to Australia? That was obviously a recalibration. What was going on then?
I think you've probably heard this story a couple of times, but I've been a bit obsessed with Australia for quite some time. So my mum's sister, my aunt and uncle moved here many, many years ago now, and my cousins were all born here in Melbourne, where I am today. And I first visited when I was 9. Kind of really long trip for a 9-year-old from Glasgow and, for our whole family. And it was really an incredible experience. And I think it was around the time of, I think about neighbours, and I remember we had a school, there was a kind of school project, and we were all divided in the class, and my group got Australia, and it was in the days of travel magazines, and I would be just sitting taking pictures of, coral from the Great Barrier Reef, and yeah, so I kind of always. It was interesting when I returned. I really, really pined for it. And when I was a medical student, a couple of my friends did the year overseas who weren't studying medicine, and I went out in my summer holidays and I stayed with them. And so they were working in Sydney in the Rocks. They had jobs in restaurants, and I was going to say it's very glamorous. We stayed opposite Tiffany's in this. In this little flat where all I remember is the cockroaches coming out of the toaster, to be honest. But I was still living the dream. And so I stayed there for a couple of weeks. We went up to Queensland to one of the other girls' family's farms. I had fresh mango for the first time, all these experiences that I remember. And then I actually came to Melbourne to see my aunt and uncle again. And so I think when I qualified, I was quite determined that I would like to come and work here. So I did do my intern year in Glasgow and 6 months of in old money in SHO in A&E. And I got on the internet to find my job. I didn't really think it very, I hadn't really thought it through, I'll be honest. I found out I was on the wrong visa. I was determined I wasn't going to go to Melbourne because my family were there. I was going to be independent. And so maybe this is the lesson in recalibration, when you step outside your comfort zone and you want to be very much doing this independently alone. I don't think you can do any of these big moves without support, and you learn that very quickly. And so I kind of landed, I was on the wrong visa. The hospital accommodation had run out. I was, quite a few hours outside Sydney without a car, and I wasn't going to be in the hospital I thought I was going to be in. I was going to be 40 minutes up the road. And I remember calling my mom, and she was like, just come home.
Oh
So I
no.
can't do that. And so I got on the internet with the BMJ careers back then, and Ron from Quantum Recruitment. Bless him, he was my other great support. He's like, get yourself to Melbourne. I had studied with a friend and colleague who is now a radiologist in Melbourne who'd done his medical training in Glasgow, and he very kindly put me up in his apartment. I had a pair of plastic drawers and a mattress on his very nice apartment in Melbourne. And so, that was how it started. And, like I stayed for 12 months. I only ever planned to do that. I came back and tried to settle in Scotland, but I kind of went home and I was like, well, in Australia, I was attracted to the emergency medicine training program. It was a lot more flexible at that point. And so 2 years later, I came back,
Hmm.
and the rest is history. I'm now a
Exactly.
Scottie.
Yeah. So what do you think you called on in those, you were young, it's different. Perhaps we're on an adventure. I think of my times when I was traveling around Europe. It's a different feeling, right? You're traveling, obstacles become part of the story. They make it more interesting. You meet more interesting people. Is that what it felt like, or were you in some kind of panic about your job and whether you'd made the wrong or right decision?
No, I don't think I was, interestingly. And, maybe that says a little bit. I don't know. There's probably a story in that in itself. I think I was quite determined, and I think that this has been a recurring theme. I've definitely, and I think we all have naysayers that'll say, "Well, why do you want to do that? Why, why would you do that?" And I think I just knew that that was right for me. And like, I think all the experiences where you maybe push your own version of comfort, you that's where the growth is. And so undoubtedly I learned a few things there. I had to wait a couple of weeks to get on the wrong visa and was rapidly running out of money. And it was in the days where the communication. I think Skype had just started, so that was good. We were able to, but I probably wasn't touching base, with family as much as you would do these days.
Have you
Um,
become a better planner as a result of those experiences?
yeah, and I think that the other thing is you can then, and maybe that's where the kind of mentorship and paying it forward. 6 months later, I had a friend come out, and I was able to then look get another apartment, set us up, and and then she then had her own experience. I remember her. We went to buy a car for her because she had quite a commute to her job, and on the very first morning. I was doing shift work. It wasn't until the evening. She called me and she said, I've broken down on the Berwick Highway with this new car.
New
Uh,
second-hand car, I imagine. Was it?
yes, it was an 18-year-old Mitsubishi Leone. I remember that.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything in all of that that you want to tell our young doctors when you're reflecting back on that time who are, in those PGY 1 to 5, those early years?
And so I think for me, that was a period of not only learning in the medical space, I actually had a really great experience in the hospital, but also personal growth and development as well. And I think if you have an inclination to do this, you're only going to learn. And I think we're very fortunate with a medical degree that we can work in, a number of places and settings and have experiences. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, I wouldn't change any of that.
Yeah. And I think knowing you a little bit that you exist in the growth zone quite a lot, and there's no growth in the comfort zone. And some people call that the growth zone or the learning zone. Some people call that the heat zone. That there has to be a little bit of heat, there has to be a bit of challenge, a bit of tension, a bit of friction to get the value out of it. That when we're in the comfort zone, it's high trust, but there's not enough kind of friction to really be learning very much. And so I think you've carried that attitude on, haven't you? Is it
Oh, I
still?
think I'm learning all the time, Sharee.
Okay, so let's move to some of your other activities, Cheryl. So you're a runner, and you don't just run around a oval. You do tricky, hard running up and down things. You're a trail runner, and you post a lot about your trail running, and the running community seems to be a really important part of your health and well-being. Can you tell us a little bit about what the running community and the running itself gives you in terms of your health and well-being?
I thought this was very brave of you to bring running into the conversation because this could very much derail.
Oh, well, I'll do my best to keep you on the track, shall we say? Pun intended.
Yeah. So I've we haven't really talked much about identities, but certainly I've identified as a runner since I was a tween. I can still, have quite vivid memories of doing the 3K cross-country run around Kelvin Grove Park in Glasgow and getting a stitch on the travelator, which was the one incline on that course. And I think still what sticks with me is, sweaty hot mess at the end and just how exhilarating that experience was for me. And I didn't really have anyone round about me who were runners, whatever that meant at the time. But certainly I became one that day. And I ran cross country at school and a little bit in early university, and then just kind of settled into just 3 times a week running through my most of my 20s and 30s when I was training. And it was probably one of my other recalibration points, post fellowship, where I was actually a little bit depleted and felt a bit spat out the other end of the program, that I, with a narrowing of interests, which I think is something that, we definitely see. And, what I haven't said is that I think you, Sharee, or perhaps if, the study of the doctor species was an academic subject, I've told you many times, you would have double doctorates. And, I think you probably see that where we, maybe exclude those other parts of ourselves. And so rediscovering my running and the running community was part of that. So I'd done a couple of marathons when I was younger. I would do, a half marathon or one or two every year. And then signed up for Melbourne Marathon um, just after my fellowship exam. And at that point, I met a couple of people who were also into what is now, I now know as trail running. I didn't know that was the thing at the time. And, my other, in addition to running, and which was mostly on roads historically, I love like hiking and climbing. And, my favorite thing to do would be to go back to Scotland and climb what we call a Munro. So there's, I think, 282 Munros in Scotland. So any mountains are over 3,000 feet. And, having a good friend, a Monroe, a good day if you're lucky, and a curry at the end. That's one of my favorite things to do. And then I discovered you could actually run in the mountains and on the trails, and that this was a thing. And that, now I realize there was plenty of places in my homeland I could have been doing that all along. I did go back to one of my local races a few years ago now. And so, I think found community, found people, also found a group quite interestingly who were quite open, particularly not just, running for physical health, but about their mental health. I can think of a few notable examples and, kind of willingness to be vulnerable and really support people. I think when you spend several hours running with people, you get to know them very well. You talk everything sublime to ridiculous. You also have periods where that you don't feel great, and that's part of the course. And, able to ride that, you might get injured. Also, in fact, if you're running, you will inevitably get injured.
Yeah.
And how you, and how, so look, I think a lot of our, and I'm talking to you, I mean, you're an expert in this space, but a lot of our, the way we perform and sustain ourselves as humans, we've learned a lot from, the sports and exercise world, but, certainly a lot of those pearls translate. And in retrospect, a lot of what I've learned through running, I wish I'd applied more deliberately in my clinical training through the years.
Yeah, well, obviously, I haven't been in clinical training in the same way as you, but I find that too. I think as we get older, we sort of perhaps appreciate more, or perhaps I'm not sure what that is, but some wisdom in terms of noticing these pearls from music. I think too, music and sport, where people who practice hard at something understand this value of doing hard things. And of course, the neuroscience is now starting to identify where in our brain this do hard things kind of is, which circuitry is involved. And we know that practicing hard things in one domain helps us very much have the tolerance and the resilience and the capacity to keep going in another domain. So I'm just distracted by the beautiful Dolomites behind you, and I want you to just talk about that for a minute, Cheryl, because you went to Italy last year and you ran with a crew of people.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if that's some sort of addition, that it's like an amplification. Now I'm going on holidays doing amazing events with people who are part of my health and wellbeing crew. Do you just talk generally about support, I guess?
Yeah, and look, I think also maybe just in terms of what focus and what matters and how that might change over time as well. And and I might mirror that with my kind of experience of clinical training through the years. And I think when you what I realized, we had a great group who went and again, it was this example of an idea that kind of grew wings, and people said, "Oh, yes," and people just, committed and turned up. And we had a group, with a 20-year age span. So I was actually the oldest runner in our group. I've been to Italy quite a few times now. It's one of my favorite places on earth, but I'd never actually run in the Dolomites, and so this was an ultramarathon event, which was just wonderful, in many many ways. But I think about, the I looked at across our different levels of kind of experience in running, and certainly, speed, it definitely declines. And I don't, kind of what I've learned, I think with age and getting slower, is that you learn a lot about how you can really, fuel and sustain your performance over time. So pacing, fueling, those things. So you really want to feel strong at the end. I might mirror that with, some of my fellowship prep. If I think I've always talked about Mount Facem and how you ascend it. If it was a mountain race, I would have started quite conservatively. I would have tried to hold it together in the middle, and then I would have brought it home hard at the end. That's not what happened. I went out really, really hard and way too enthusiastic. And I kind of started to peter out about halfway to two-thirds up, and I limped to the finish line, and crawled over it. And I think I want a view like this. That wasn't the view I had at the end. You kind of hoping for those peak experiences, and I think that was quite disappointing to me.
Can we just pause there a little bit, Cheryl? What did you do? Who helped you? What happened to help you get across that line when you really were depleted and limping, as you say?
So I think, that you wanted to focus on recalibration, and that's probably been one of my more major recalibration points. And I think that's, maybe common. It's not an uncommon experience. When you're pushing hard for something, there's a risk that you're going to overreach. And overreaching is part of that. And I mentioned maybe what I'd learned in retrospect, and I don't know if you have to learn these mistakes yourself. I don't know if other people listening to this makes it any easier. Um, I'll just take a slight segue if it's okay. You spent a lot of my registrar years reading books, and we were talking about them recently, called Bounce Backs. So a great series by an emergency physician, Mike Weinstock, on patients that come back again. So we kind of get it wrong the first time, whatever, wrong, and they're giving us another chance. And so, I think when somebody does come back, that's the opportunity to stop, refocus, elevate experience, think again. And, by reading these and reading the examples, I was hoping that, that I might not make those, those mistakes. We might talk about error in medicine, and it's really complex. Most of the time. But sometimes maybe you actually have to, that's where we've talked about that, when you do have setbacks, you have challenges and things don't go as planned, that's when the growth is, and that's when the learning is, even though it's hard in the moment. And so for me, again, that required stepping away. It required support of some critical friends, having trusted family, peers, a few mentors. Certainly some people that thought, what are you doing? This is crazy. But again, you kind of have to listen to yourself as well. I still had quite a few skills. I mean, if anyone has not read The Thriving Doctor, I read your book and I thought, this is the journey I've been on, and I'm still on it. You talk about those intrapersonal skills. So the opportunity for, introspection and introspection, actually be able to know what's happening in your own internal space, which you might switch off when you're trying to peak, to trying to just reach a goal. And sometimes you get lost in why you're kind of doing that, and I think it was Christine who on my podcast who said, you're kind of not enjoying that journey, yeah, there's a good chance you might get there, and it's not quite what you thought it was going to be. And I think the other thing, I mean, again, I've learned a lot of things that we haven't talked about in my podcast, but through my guests who've been through similar experiences, this idea of doing joy first. not the delayed gratification that we can do to just, I will finish the study session, I will do the exam, I will get through this set of night shifts, and then I will do the fun thing, rather than actually scheduling in rest, joy, the things that matter through those periods.
Yeah.
And I've gone on a tangent there.
That's okay. I want to come back around to your podcast, but before we leave the running and sustained activities like that go over a longer period of time are fantastic opportunities for metacognition, for noticing what you're thinking, raising your awareness, and sometimes for mindfulness, that we're practicing mindfulness as we're plotting, the cadence of your feet, for instance, as a runner. I imagine that there are times, even though you're running with other people, where there's not much talking, where you are kind of just managing your own self, your own body and your own mind. And can you just speak to that a little bit, the power or the benefit perhaps of the metacognition, that noticing when your mind is helping you or not helping you?
I think there's many people have said they've solved their problems at the end of a run, and I think I've been doing that for many years now. And sometimes, so I do run still on my own, and yeah, I usually don't plan to think about anything in particular, but sometimes you will find yourself, doing exactly what you've said, thinking about thinking. Um, Interestingly, when I'm with other people, I do like to chat, and it's actually a sign that I'm struggling physically when I have stopped
And not,
talking.
yeah.
So it's very obvious when
You
I am
notice that
struggling.
you notice that with your peers as well,
Oh,
with
yes, they
runners?
know when I am quiet, I am struggling.
But do you notice that with them too, that sometimes
Yes.
they have signals as well when they're struggling?
Although some of the more skilled runners, it's like, again, I run with people I'm in awe, and if you're the fastest runner in the room, you're in the wrong room if you're trying to
Yeah,
improve. So I
yeah,
certainly surround with
that's it.
myself with people who are,
Yeah.
who, well, in terms of what they can do, physically and mentally, it's really quite impressive.
That's the other thing that's occurring to me as you're talking, this risk of comparison. I'll just maybe touch on that again, that, that it's a place of, well, it kills your joy, to use the word that you've been talking about. So it's very easy to fall into, humans do that all the time, that, oh, look at them, they're advancing sooner than me. They got on a training program, I haven't got on a training program. They've got this great supervisor, I haven't got a supervisor. I'm not keeping up with my cohort. These kinds of things, doctors say things like that to me very regularly. So again, I'm just noticing, listening to you, that this practice of running with other people and noticing what's happening in your own body and noticing how you are compared to you is perhaps another side effect, I suppose, of these kinds of activities outside of medicine.
And I think, we have we've got a couple of decades between our group of runners. And, I think the good thing is you can pick the run to, with my super fast elite friend, I can get her on the recovery phase when she's just, ready to cruise, which is quite good. If I'm looking to actually train for something, I can pick the running friend that's, going to just pushed me a little bit and take me out of my comfort zone, because if I was left to my own devices, I find that quite hard. But I have to say, increasingly, I'm not particularly competitive with my running. I'm there for the joy of it.
Yeah, totally.
But I think
So
you said, what you've said about comparison, and it's, what is it? It's the thief of joy, isn't it? And
yeah. So
being able to be in your own lane and comfortable with that, and know, what that is, and what is important for you. Again, I think that's also something you're continually recalibrating.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm diverting all over the place, so we'll get back on track in a minute. But that's having me think about values too. And we used to teach, psychologists used to teach that you get your values established in your late teens. You separate from your parents, and you establish which ones of their values you want to keep and which ones you want to have that distinguish you, that make you different. And the research and the teaching now is much more about values evolving and developing, just like all the other parts of us evolve and develop. And so where we might be competitive and striving in the earlier part of our life, as we get into these middle years and further on, that might become, it might be more about service, or it might be more about community. And that these values, not that we've turned our back on ourselves or some critical story that we might create for ourselves. It's that our values are evolving in the same way that all the other parts of us evolve. And that they do provide really important anchors to where we are in the world. So I want to check in. You had an injury a couple of years ago. You injured your elbow, which, took a sustained effort on its own to recover. Another point of recalibrating. What happened then for you in terms of
I'm now thinking of Andrea when we're talking about this and her shoulder. And
Yes.
so, look, my elbow injury was, it's fairly minor in the scheme of things, but I think for me it was quite interesting. Probably a bit of a minor miracle that I had not fallen off a mountain before now or before then. I've been quite fortunate that, I've mostly bounced. And I mean, this is a pursuit that I choose to be involved in. This is the risks associated with it. I still think I would be more of a liability on a bike. But on this particular occasion, I would say that technical descending is not my forte. And unfortunately, I have injured myself twice on, exactly on that kind of terrain. And, you actually reach mental barriers then in terms of improvement. And I got to a stage where I was just progressing and then this happened. So I had a bad bounce. And, I think because you've mentioned, I think what's interesting in the context of this conversation, and maybe I had some skills by then. So I think that's the other thing because I did kind of walk out and, drove myself to my own emergency department, wrote my x-ray, and I kind of went round thinking, oh, it's just a flake off the olecranon. I'm pretty sure it's going to be fine. And then I kind of saw it and I thought, and my first thought was, I can't fix this. Yeah, I can't do this one. This is, I'm actually going to have to outsource this and I'm going to have to surrender. And I'd remember the kind of mental processing, looking at the x-ray, thinking, okay, but I think, if that had happened to me, and again, fairly minor in the scheme of things, but 10 or 15 years previously, I probably would have spiraled. This is a disaster. And I think maybe, by my having gone through a bit of a journey by that point, then, that was actually, I had some skills and tools to be able to think, right, I'm going to have surgery, I'm going to have to surrender, I'm going to have to give in, I'm going to have to, just recover. That's body's called it.
So you're saying that like as if, anyone can get the skills and the resources. And as a psychologist, I certainly believe people can get the skills and the resources. But can you tell us a little bit more about what were the skills that you used and the resources and what was involved in getting them? What were the things that you had done that you found yourself then being, I guess, grateful for having the skills and the tools?
So I think I mentioned my kind of drop off at fellowship, and I took a couple of years of opportunity to do different things, a lot of navel gazing and probably soul searching. So I've practiced yoga for a number of years, and do you know what? I feel sometimes it just gets such a bad rap in our healthcare community these days, but I'm going to go here. I had been, a student of yoga for a number of years, and I actually did a yoga teacher training course, a 350-hour year-long course that really was quite transformative for me. And I think the interesting parts of that were not the physical and asana practice and getting better at doing a handstand. It was that, when you've already alluded to values, I'd never actually thought about what my values were. I didn't have any idea about, kind of, what mattered, what my mission statement, what I'm actually here on the planet for. And that was really an opportunity to do all of that in addition to, we've talked about my running. The thing about running is, which is great, but it, sometimes to actually do nothing and to be very still and alone with your thoughts and, and it is really challenging. And to do that, that kind of more meditation type practice, which I still struggle with. I do like the movement side even of yoga practice to get into that introspection that we talked about and the interoception to actually get into body and space. And so that was one part of it. I also changed jobs at the time. I did a few different jobs. I was doing some work in sports medicine. I did some training. I did, some other occupational visa jobs, things to give me space beyond shift work to actually do that. And I had my fellowship at the time. I still did some locum emergency medicine through that period. Quite interestingly, I kind of went to my one of the conferences at the time, And I think day three was entirely devoted to doctors' well-being. And this was back in about 2013, 14. And and a lot of it was very much focused on individuals at that point and positive psychology, and there was a bit of meditation and mindfulness. I think we've both had many, many conversations since and widened the net. I think had I had a Sharee Johnson at that point, that would have undoubtedly helped, but I had to outsource some of that. I think I mean I don't know if you mind me segueing into. I mean, I know you were going to maybe ask
Go
me
ahead,
about the
please.
podcast,
Yeah.
but I think again, an example of just because you've seen somebody else go through something doesn't mean you won't. It doesn't really protect you from those experiences. And I think I've been a fan of the podcast genre since I think the first generation of podcasting in the early 2000s. But even thinking, before that, when I was again a tween, seeing my dad kind of mid to late 30s and kind of going through that period, and I call it the big squeeze, the 30s, 40s, when you're doing work and family and parents and all of those things where it's glass balls in the air, let the rubber ones drop, but remember you're a glass ball too, and constantly recalibrating which is which. And so, kind of saw him go through a bit of a journey at that point, and he used to listen to what I call professional and personal development tapes when we were on the drive to school. There was a lot of Stephen Covey, there was Peter Drucker, and there was a lot because that was the kind of time when a lot of the business, time management and stress, kind of regulation and management was coming to the fore. And a bit of Deepak Chopra, so that more holistic lens. And so I think that left quite an impression on me. I have to say that, that my dad's never been on a yoga mat, but through that period, I would say he practices yoga because it's that, being able to kind of union body and mind and calibration, this whole theme of this conversation has been calibration. Didn't necessarily protect me from, doing the same. And I actually think many of us are vulnerable to this repeatedly through this
Yeah.
period. I get, in my clinical work, I get to see that. I get to hold space for that, which is actually kind of coming full circle because, this is something that, I think you kind of, when you have a bit of lived experience, which many of us do, it's very relevant.
I think that the critical thing is awareness and reflection. And, the medical board says that that's a core competency that it wants doctors to develop. It doesn't necessarily tell us how to do it, how people should do that, but they definitely say they want doctors to be doing that. This process of noticing what we're doing, and, you're talking about the yoga, the union between mind and body, that process of being able to say, what's happening in my body right now and how do I respond to it, rather than just that reactive way of being. That seems to me the difference. And can we learn it from hearing other people's stories? I think we can learn that something's possible, or we can open up our curiosity about, I wonder if that could be true for me, that resonance. And certainly I've seen senior doctors telling their stories of distress or burnout or trauma to junior doctors, and it having a very big impact on the junior doctors. I think there is a question of something about developmental here, adult development, that I can hear as a young person an older person's story, and I can resonate and I can be impressed by it or worried about it. I don't necessarily believe it's going to happen to me. And so lots of people say to me, why don't I do more work with young doctors? And we have tried lots of different things with junior doctors. Most of our clients are mid-career doctors because they've got a lot to hang it on.
Very interesting.
So
why do you think that is?
Well, I just think that there's a beautiful thing about youth, and sometimes I call it the arrogance of youth. And I don't mean to insult any young doctors who are listening or any young people in general. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing about that part of our life, that we feel brave, that we feel adventurous, that we feel like we could. And as we get older, we, put on all the onion skins, that we have a few wounds and a few scars, and we start to get a bit cautious, or, we have responsibilities, and so we get a bit more cautious. And so we perhaps lose that adventurous, confident spirit that we have in our early 20s. But while we're busy doing that in our early 20s, we're not necessarily realistic about how stuff can happen to us. By the time you get to be 40, 45, 50, stuff has happened. People have had relationship breakdowns. People have lost jobs or got a job that they want and find out that they actually don't like it, or they're not willing to put enough effort in to do it. It's not what they thought it was. And so that starts to change our identity, doesn't it? Who we think we are and what we think we're capable of. You used two interesting words, Cheryl. Earlier, you talked about identity and that shift or that rediscovering your running identity. And you also used a word there before, a surrender. You said surrender twice. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that's important, this ability to be able to surrender?
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, we have our finite locus of control, and I think being able to realize that what is it? I think Pema Chodron says this really best, you are the sky, everything else is just the weather. I love that. And, I think, and again, maybe my yoga practice kind of helped me think a little bit more about surrender. Because that's certainly, what's the most difficult pose? It's Shavasana, and that's a pose of surrender. And actually, that's the hardest one. And
So just for people that don't know Shavasana, can you just explain what?
so that's the pose at the end. The other name is corpse pose, where you have to lie down, and it's quite common that people will fall asleep and snore in that pose. And to be honest, if that's what you need, then that's what you
Yeah,
need.
yeah.
But to be able
It's a
to
pose of
switch,
it's a pose of vulnerability, though, isn't it? You're lying
yes,
flat on your back with your arms out, open.
yeah.
It's
And I
exposed. Your
think
soft belly is exposed. Mm.
there are even more vulnerable poses that are like that when you have heart opening, hip opening, that you kind of explore through the physical practice of yoga. And those actually can be very uncomfortable poses for people initially. And depending on, what that past experience, the trauma history has been. And I think, that in itself, you kind of learn that as an individual. And I've done a bit of teaching and, as a teacher as well, and just in terms of how you cue people safely and um, surrender. Yeah. I think it's, it's, yeah, again, I think that's a constant recalibration, isn't it? And it's depending on, circumstance.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's such a beautiful thing that you've introduced into the conversation because, being a health professional in our roles as health professional, we're so often in control. We are the person in the room with the patient who has the power to the extent of we know how the system works and what's available and what will happen next. And it's a struggle for health professionals to be in that patient or the less powerful position. Go on, you want to say something?
I wanted to explore something with you, if that's okay, because I have been kind of thinking about this and I thought it might be an opportunity in this conversation. Um, so I think you talk a lot about the tenets of perfectionism, stoicism, competition, and you
Mm.
have to read The Thriving Doctor. And I've listened to many, and had many conversations with you about this. And I think we've said before that some of what makes us good at the work is also in it, and I think this translates across many areas. Can also be to our detriment, personally. But I think also, I think it was Graham Walker on my podcast recently. We were just talking about, and I don't know if you listened to it.
I did.
You kind of rely on you actually want someone to be that little, have that little baseline anxiety, that little bit of perfectionism that's like something isn't adding up here. I want to think about this. I want to go home and it's all very well to say we're going to set boundaries around work and we're going to leave work, but I've never been a person who can clearly do that very well. I've tried and practiced, but
Mm.
actually thinking about the people I see, their stories, and that's actually an important way, it's part of what I do as a doctor, and I think it's important. And so how you kind of do that, but still, you know, create the boundaries and the space around that. I think that's a constant struggle, and I don't know, you get the opportunity to explore this with many of us.
Mm.
I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Mm. Well, it's so individual, isn't it? I think there's an active choice in all of these things. And it comes back to the metacognition before that when we're aware of I'm still thinking about that patient today. I've been thinking about them all night. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm still thinking about them. That's rumination. And so we want to distinguish rumination or catastrophizing, or, sometimes we're generalizing beyond where we really should generalize. We want to distinguish that from caring.
Yeah,
So
great.
I think that's about awareness, and sometimes we can do that ourselves. We can be journal writing, or we can be going for a long run, or we can find that ourselves and notice that ourselves. And it's a practice. The more we practice this metacognition, this awareness, the better we can get at it. But sometimes we can't see it ourselves. Sometimes we need another person, a peer, a friend, a partner, the dog, our coach, our supervisor. Sometimes we need a formal process. Sometimes it can be an informal process where we give voice to this, where we say, I can't stop thinking about this patient, or I've came back to see this patient at 9 o'clock at night, and I wouldn't normally do that, but I needed to start to understand what actually is operant then.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, I think I definitely ruminated a lot early in my career, and I'm still prone to it, but I probably now have, again, it's tools and skills that, what we'll call collegial oversight and that really
Yeah.
critical peer support. I have a little network of people that I can then call, discuss. And I think, when I think about that in the setting of, hospital safety and clinical error, and I think that's kind of interesting because we need a whole support network. I think I did a safety talk a couple of years ago when I was looking at the WHO guidelines on this, and the actual support for the clinicians involved, it was a kind of short paragraph. And I think we've evolved a lot in terms of open disclosure and really trying to not blame individuals and think about systems. But I still feel that that's an area we still could do much better. And I think just thinking just about kind of risk and comfort zones and failure and setbacks, the kind of dichotomy of seeing that the way we approach that in medicine then and in life, and how that can translate. And I think the work of Professor Amy Edmondson on this topic, kind of just thinking about failure and what it means in the different types. So, I think we in medicine we think a lot about, the simple failures, which are the kind of never events, the kind of wrong site surgery. And, we should have good, robust clinical governance systems to support and, make those very, very, zero is what we aim for. Whereas a lot of error that we see in medicine, or failure, whatever, for in inverted commas, is complex and pervasive, and it involves humans and systems, and we talk about the Swiss cheese when all of those holes line up. But the bit that we don't perhaps talk about enough is this concept of intelligent failure. And we can transplant hearts because of intelligent failure. All the innovation, the growth. That's the bit where we've got to remember that in healthcare, that's actually really matters too. So that should give us some courage to translate into our lives in terms of how we kind of go forward.
Yeah, totally. For those who don't know Amy Edmondson's work, we'll put those her two books
Yeah, I
in
mean, I
the show
think
notes.
both books, the Fearless Organization.
Yeah. So let's move along a little bit. I really want you to tell us a bit more about the podcast. In particular, I want you to tell us, why you started a podcast. You told us that you had a love of the medium. What was it in 2020 that led to you saying, right, I'm going to do this. I want to talk to some people, and I want to do that with an audience. What happened? What was that recalibration?
So I'll just say that I thought about starting that podcast for many years before that, and there was a lot of procrastination. I think the 2020 will probably already ring
Give it
some
away.
bells amongst your audience, that it was the the COVID pandemic fueled a lot of innovation startups. People who had put off projects for a lot of time. I think we were also able to innovate at quite impressive scale in a number of areas because we cut red tape, but we also had some time and to be able to do that when we were social distancing at home. So, I think that was actually something I thought about, and that really just, I had no excuses anymore. I didn't have the excuse that I have no time to do
A
it.
lot of doctors are shy though about media. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. And again, maybe I'm learning as I go still. I so my podcast is really capturing mostly conversations that I was having. It's not giving clinical advice, but it's really about, a lot of what you'll find in a lot of your work, Sharee, those what I'm going to call core skills.
Mm.
We actually get to talk about those and will not have the word soft skills used. And to have conversations with actually a number of people, not just clinicians now, and what we might learn in terms of, from some of their stories. I mean, I think I've already said, can we learn from other people's stories? But I definitely think I have learned a lot from so many of my guests. And I think that, it's a bit of a selfish passion project in many ways because, it fuels my curiosity and learning and growth. So
Mm.
been very fortunate to um,
So the podcast, I don't think I said its name, is The Mindful Medic. And it's extraordinary, Cheryl. I mean, the guests that you've had on there, and three that come to mind, just powerhouses really kind of, or two of them have been definitely idols or mentors at a distance to me, which is Amy Edmondson and Bob Chapman. I couldn't believe that you had Bob Chapman on your podcast. That was outstanding conversation. Please, if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to The Mindful Medic, really you could listen to every episode and get so much out of it, but those two in particular. And of course, the other one is our mutual friend, Jonathan Fisher, who you had a beautiful conversation with, I think not last year, the year before. So it's
and with yourself, you haven't mentioned that.
well, it was very early days, right?
And I know, and I reached out and I just kept hearing your name. And so many of my colleagues that you had helped, as I say, I didn't have a Sharee Johnson, now 13 years ago. But I thought I have to meet this amazing women and coach of doctors who's helped so many of my colleagues. So thank you. And I know you've continued to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Um,
My pleasure. So you talked about joy earlier, and I think that you've just said that the podcast is a passion project. And I wonder if there's any reflection you might make out loud for the audience, not just the doctors, anybody who's listening, about this, the value that comes from having a passion project. A lot of people will say, I haven't got time for that, or I don't have the skills for that, or I don't know where to start, or, I've got all these other obligations that I need to attend to. What's been the real benefit or value for you personally in having these passion projects, the podcast being one of them?
I mean, I think in addition to, I said, the learning, it's the connections, it's the people that I've met. And, I think that the kind of beauty for me is that they have become friends, many of them. And, I have people across the world. And I think it really, and I think maybe COVID, as a catalyst for that, because a lot of my conversations are like this, they're hybrid, or via Zoom. And, I've since gone and met people in real places, and I think what's surprised me is that after many virtual conversations, you feel like you know people, and then you can just quite easily sit down and just continue the conversation you've been having. So I can think of a few people that stand out. I'm sure you could name them too. So
Well,
um,
I think the other thing that's really interesting that I'm really enjoying in this conversation, when we're talking about the running and now we're talking about the podcast, is the breadth. And maybe I can move to, in 2023, I think you started an MBA, global MBA with the Melbourne Business School, where there were very few health professionals in your cohort. And I just, I think this, often it's been my experience that doctors have a very narrow, or doctors who don't have these extra other things going on, are very immersed in the doctor world, in the medical world. And there seems to me a loss in a person's experience or capacity to really feel alive and fulfilled if it's all about work. And medicine can very easily invite you in to give your whole life and all of your energy to it, and to lose those other opportunities. So I think it's a beautiful role modeling. It's it's kind of quintessential the way that we're describing your experience or your life, where medicine's definitely a core. It's taking a lot of your time and effort and energy, and then there are these overlapping ways, these other things that have some medicine in them, like you run with some other medical friends, but
I
you
run
also
with a lot of doctors,
run
and
with other
that's peer
people.
support on the run. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can't help talking
Yeah,
shop.
yeah, of course, of course. But let's move into this other experience of the MBA. What happened with it for you?
Yeah, and look, for me, and that look, I was in a place where I was able to do this, and there's a lot of privilege associated with that. But it's something I had thought about again for a number of years. Again, those percolating thoughts,
Yeah.
and and again, I've had a few people say, "Why would you want to do that?"
Yeah.
So, the naysayers. Fortunately, I've learned to switch those voices off, and. Yeah, look, for me, it was, I mean, I don't think you have to do an MBA to have a different and transformative experience, but for me, it really was. I think it was an opportunity to, again, it's the lifelong learning. It's to be around some really interesting, kind of driven, enthusiastic people, and go to new places, learn new things. I think the other part of it that I was afforded, and again, back to what you said about self-reflection, I think my program director said this is an opportunity not only to, to actually connect with, people outside your own kind of profession and discipline and life experience, but also to do a lot of deep reflection and navel gazing. So there was a lot of reflective work as part of that, and we had to do that was really, part of that assessment process was each module a reflective assignment, and then for some of the overseas modules, quite in depth, 5,000 words of
Mm.
navel gazing and self-reflection. So, I kind of think that my program director probably knows most of us better than we know ourselves, having, kind of really, and the way that's what you're privy to in your clinical work as well, or your professional work,
Mm.
um, where people can actually share all of those things.
Mm. Do you have a different view? Did you see some different, I often think that our life or our personhood is like a diamond with lots of different facets. It depends which kind of side we're looking at, which face we're looking at
I love
that,
that.
So maybe health is like that too. Did you look back at health? Did you look over at health from your position in the MBA with those other folks who weren't medical and see some new things?
I couldn't help, do everything through a healthcare lens, which I think was great because, how do we learn from outside ourselves in health? And, I think what was so beautiful about that experience is you brought a group together and you kind of you get to kind of play and experiment with different ideas, and somebody says, well, we do it this way in our environment, and have you thought about this? And then occasionally you have to solve a problem together, and you realize you've got somebody who might actually know all the answers, but there's somebody also very quiet who really thinks left of field and has that something that might actually be quite game changing to the whole equation. And how do you get that voice out? So we all got really to kind of think about how maybe we haven't talked much about leadership, but it's a good way to kind of in a safe environment to experiment with that, and how you hold space, and that you don't have to be the expert as the leader, but how do you get the best out of the people right about you? How do you get the ideas, the voices, the teams, and create something better than each as individuals could? So I think that was really a great experience.
It's the diversity model, isn't it? That, the
Mm.
diverse experience can create something new.
And I think again, a bit like yoga, the MBA now also gets, so you're gonna have, I think for me, it came at the right time. It was great. I'm gonna not forget that experience, and I'm hopefully gonna keep learning from it. I've made lifelong connections,
Mm.
which is also the wonderful thing about it.
Mm. Can you tell us a story of one person that somehow influenced you or led to a recalibration? Could
So
be
she
anyone,
won't
any
mind me
part of
sharing
your
the
life.
story. And so I'll not name her, but we have spoken about this a few times, and and I think it was back to that kind of group dynamic. I am medical brain. I'm actually quite qualitative in how I think about things, which may not surprise you. And I was working together on a project that I was going to be presenting with, very, super smart, intelligent, and the engineer brain fascinates me. Very quantitative engineer, very much detail orientated, and we clashed. Quite frustratingly to both of us,
Mm.
and that was really quite a struggle. 'Cause up to that point, I hadn't really had much in the way of, if you want to say conflict and kind of lean into that. And we worked through it, and we produced something that we're both really proud of. And we've talked about it since that neither of us as individuals could have come up with what we ultimately produced. And it was hard to do that, but we had to work together and we had to realize we were coming from very different perspectives. And that was very uncomfortable. So
So
I think that was one of the things that stood out.
how did you manage that, Cheryl? What were you saying or doing to you inside of yourself to keep working on that project with that person?
So you can imagine I went for a run at some point through that.
Long runs every day. What else? What else was
Um,
helping you?
but then realized that was not gonna get us any further forward. So yeah, no, I think maybe a bit of surrender again, and also but listening. It's like kind of, I mean, it's really again recalibrating. What are we both contributing? What are we trying to achieve? What's the goal? And how do we do this together? And so that we can both bring out the best of us and contribute to make it, something,
Yeah.
much
So
better than we could produce on our own.
I'm hearing that thing that we heard earlier about intention, that kind of really active choice that I chose to be here and I want to be in this program and I've got to find a way forward with this situation.
Yeah. And look again, this is the beauty of something like that. It's like simulation. You
Mm,
get, the stakes are not real. And so, I think you get to play and practice at the discomfort and I mean otherwise you're doing, I mean, look, I think still the best way to learn is, to do it, but to be able to be a bit more intentional. And I think, again, some of those skills hopefully translate.
mm.
Mm.
I feel like we've come full circle in our conversation. We're back around to the comfort zone and the learning zone. So I wonder, just give me a minute. Oh yes, I do want to ask you about the doctor wellbeing thing before we finish. So before we finish, Cheryl, we're really running out of time now, but I want to ask you about the doctor wellbeing. You mentioned that I came on your podcast, and that was in 2021, and we were talking an awful lot then. COVID was happening about doctor wellbeing and healthcare workers in general's wellbeing, and I felt very excited at that time that it was finally fully properly on the table. Was my experience. Um, and we're 5 years on. We've made it through COVID. We've all had lots of amazing experiences through that time, and we're still talking about doctor wellbeing, healthcare wellbeing. I'm not sure that we've really made that much progress. I think it's okay to talk about. It's easier to talk about. It's more on the agenda now. In terms of actual real change, perhaps doctors feel a little freer to shape shift and have portfolio careers. Perhaps that might be a real thing. Um, I still hear many, many of the same stories that I was hearing 10 years ago in coaching. I wonder if you could, we don't have a magic wand, but if there were one or two things that you thought would significantly shift the needle in some way, what where's your thinking go?
Yeah. So, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and
Mm,
I find this still a really hard question.
mm,
And, I've kind of I told you my individual kind of story and to really thinking more about systems and teams. And, that's where a lot of my emphasis has and focus has been over a number of years. And I do think there's pockets of, really excellent achievements. I still think, how we can take some of those examples, I'm very much, how do we take that? How do we, take the example, pilot, iterate, and scale in our own environment, knowing that, without having to reinvent the wheel every time. And there are, so many of those.
mm,
But then I keep coming then back again, full circle to individuals. And I think the work that you do, I love this word agentic because you are giving agency to us and you're helping us to develop those core, intra and interpersonal skills.
mm,
Because the system is made up of people and, we make the system and, it takes we'll take a critical number, and, kind of elevation of voice and maybe some other skills. I mean, I think that what I struggle with is maintaining momentum.
mm.
And I think many of us who have been doing this for some time do
Yes.
because, I sometimes if you particularly have some individuals who are doing great work and we're not really thought about succession planning, it could just take them to have to leave or step back or, change of, other leadership or funding, and things fall apart. And it's probably the first thing that goes. And I think that's the kind of concern. It's still maybe an added extra, not really something that we do as core business.
You don't know it, but I feel like you kind of hit me in the heart a bit then, because we've had multiple conversations with multiple different colleges and employers about piloting group coaching programs, and multiple people having coaching at the same time with a group of coaches, but individually, to see if those kinds of things make any difference. Do they shift the needle in terms of doctor voice or doctor agency, or do we identify thematic skills that are missing in those kinds of processes? And I can think of half a dozen times off the top of my head where the person that we're building a relationship with has gone on maternity leave, or has been made redundant, or has moved to a different employer in some shape or other, and that progress that we thought we
And your
made
champion has
towards
gone, your
those.
sponsor's gone.
Yeah. So, I really felt that one.
And I think you're asking all those right, they are all the right questions.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I want to finish on a happier note. The system struggle goes on. And I think, like you, there are times when I surrender, and there are times when I feel like, no, right, let's get back amongst it. And it is a collective voice thing. So when we're thinking about the infinite game, we're thinking about how the game goes on way beyond any of us individually. That actually gives me a lot of hope. When I was first coaching doctors, there were very few other coaches working with doctors. There were plenty of coaches around, but very few focusing with clinical staff. And now there are lots and lots of coaches working with doctors, and lots of doctors interested in what is coaching and can it add value. So, when you get in your helicopter and you get that bigger picture view, I think we can see
progress in the moment. You're right. I was talking about, this very same concept to a colleague recently. Yeah, progress is not linear.
No, that's exactly right. So
I've just got the visual image now of the mountains where you see the person who's just got to the summit, and then they look up and then there's
oh no, this is not
there's 10 more.
I thought you were going to say that sometimes we're standing on a mountain and we can see so clearly the other mountain and the other person on the other mountain. We can't see where we're going, but we can see the other mountain.
Yeah.
A little way. So, yeah. Okay, so as we're finishing up, thank you so much for your time. I could just talk to you all day. Please,
likewise,
if you're listening, get onto the Mindful Medic podcast. It's just a treasure trove. Do you, as a way of finishing, Cheryl, do you have any particular mantras? Is there something that you go around reminding yourself of when you're in the thick of a time that looks like it's going to need, a recalibration is going to be required? What do you say? How do you keep yourself in the game in those moments?
Yeah, so two things. I mean, I think the progress is not linear is important. And, I think about this even in my clinical practice when I share the injury recovery. There's a great BMJ article, or sports, I think it was a sports medicine BMJ, the map of, what we think it should look like and then what it actually looks like. So we've got the linear line, and then we've got so that is life. It's not just, injury recovery. That is how we progress. But I think the other thing, and I'm very conscious I do not want to be the first person to swear on your podcast, so I'm going to amend this slightly. But it's know your stuff.
Is it an unfair stereotype for me to say you're not a true ED doctor if you don't?
Or a Scots woman, I don't know. Know your stuff, give a stuff, take no stuff, stuff happens. And you can imagine you can replace the word stuff. But I think that's an important kind of reminder to me. It's the rules of medicine, it's the rules of life. That occasionally, the code brown will happen. But if you're passionate about what you do, you deliberate, you accept that there's going to be setbacks. And, I think doing anything with purpose, we didn't really get to talk much about that, but, I think one of the episodes I might just highlight is the one with Dr. Colin West, who talks a lot about, we talked about values, meaning, value, and purpose. But the MBA take on that is your minimum viable product. And I think in any one moment, what is the next step? What is the minimal viable product? You don't have to have solved everything tomorrow, one more step.
Well, it's an absolute gift of my life to have crossed paths with you, and I hope we continue to keep crossing.
No, that privilege is mine.
Thank you for being here today, Cheryl, and for all of your work in the world to help us all understand healthcare and how we can take care of each other.
Yeah, thank you for all the work you do with my colleagues.
Okay, well, that was a fantastic conversation with Cheryl. I felt joyful the whole time I was talking with her. I noticed that we're both smiling a lot, so I hope that you were smiling too as you were listening to some of her stories. You know, the young doctor coming out to Australia with the fantasy in mind about how it was all going to be, ending up sleeping on the blow-up bed with an old friend who could put her up while she sorted out what she was going to do, and her mum on the other end of the phone saying, please just come home. You know, the recalibration that she went through when she rediscovered her running and working out how to put that back into her life, and the benefit of that, starting a podcast, being involved in many other portfolio areas in preventative medicine now as well as emergency medicine. I think Cheryl's story hopefully can give many of you courage or inspiration, or perhaps just some joy about really adding some variety into your medical life. Your skills are very transferable, and certainly if there's something that you have a curiosity about, a passion for, let's see if we can help you find a way into that. Talk about it with your friends, and dare to dream. See you next time. May you be well. The content in this podcast is not intended to constitute or be a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional. This podcast represents the views of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of any entity we work with or for.